what do we do? How do we make that happen? Because setting a price on carbon and fixing the epic market failure of this externality is key. But like you and I can talk about it, we can sit until we're blue in our faces. Unless we find what unlocks Texas to do it, it's just intellectual.
Yeah, I know it's painful. I know it's frustrating. I know turning blue in the face is not fun, but I think we need to continue doing it, and we need more people speaking up about it, because we need to convince the vested interests, the political interests, the leaders, the people that have something to lose by buying into this system, that it's the right way to go, and that it makes, from an economic efficiency perspective, it's the right way to go. And if the status quo is not an option, it is the most viable option. So I think we just need to continue talking about it, making the case, and convincing people. I do sadly believe that things are going to get worse before they get better, right, in terms of climate impacts and our emissions.
I think we're all on the same page there.
I'll just say I am tempering my cynicism a little bit, because I am seeing a lot more momentum towards carbon offsets. And I'll say that I was listening to a panel that Aurora was on a couple of weeks ago talking about carbon offsets. And I think the importance, and I think what you said was that even though you may not be able to sort of get to these goals, you're really focused on creating those metrics to get people to get there. So, even though, corporates and others may not have good intentions, hypothetically, there is that kind of movement, I feel, to start keeping track of carbon emissions, start thinking about carbon offsets, at least putting a price on it that I think will be useful in the long run. So I am slightly more bullish, Pablo.
I mean, I can say from a Swedish perspective, what's been interesting here, the Swedish Financial Regulatory Authority, which is probably called something slightly different, Finansinspektionen, they've been quite strong in their messaging. We have a systemic risk. The fact that so many companies are emitting, not measuring properly, and at some point a price on carbon is coming. And we already have a quite high price on carbon, but just for a fraction of the emitters. But that will obviously increase. And if you see that transition happening relatively quickly, i.e. over the next 2 or 3 years, what will happen to a small country like Sweden when we'll see across the board margin decrease and profit decrease. And I think it's interesting, and maybe we could export that language and that narrative, systemic risk in the face of regulation. But Bud, what's your take on that?
Well, I'm going to actually circle back to your question about what's if we were just talking, what's the area that I would say to you, I want Swedish investors, I want Swedish innovation and finance. And
I love the voice. I want Swedish innovation.
Give me Swedish innovation. What's going to be required, regardless of whether you're powering your grid with a lot of coal like the United States or your 80% emissions-free generation in Canada, is there's not enough electricity. There's load growth that's going to happen on a massive scale in North America, in Europe, in China, and everywhere else. And we know that ideally we need to have that load growth happen with non-emitting fuels, nuclear, whatever, hydro, conventional hydro. The challenge is we're going to have so many cars, we're going to have so much demand because we're defossil fueling the heating systems in North America, where we use natural gas in a lot of places for heating our houses. Of course, Charles knows in Quebec, electricity is used for that. We need more electricity. Now, there's a generation issue. There's a transmission from where it's generated to the distribution system that gets it to residential places. What I want to see from Swedish investors, inventors, founders is a set of solutions that can go from the generation part all the way to the home delivery part and charging your electric car. And a great space for that is actually AI. It's high tech. It's the programming issues that help determine where you need to send the electricity and when, what's the most effective networking system to send them through, modulating demand, educating people on demand use. There's a whole area of addressing electricity load growth not through having to add more generation or more transmission or more distribution, but through smart metering and smart activation of those systems. Look, Sweden, you've got the brains to help, I think, deploy some of this technology. Energy management software is what, at the end of the day, what we could point to. That's just one aspect of a solution that's going to be needed not just in North America, but globally. The great thing is Canada.
I have that. We have lots of that. But I think one thing to circle back to where we started, which is, do we believe in cooperation? Will this be one big happy family against a common enemy, or do we need to rely on market forces here? Is it important that we're actually competing for the best solutions? What would you say?
I think competition is essential, and this competition is going to be brutal for the next decade, but eventually there's going to be winners. It's like, okay, to date myself, Betamax will win over, or VHS will win over Betamax, whoever won that particular battle of the technologies.
And the rest of you, Charles, what's your take?
So for me, after I'm more hands-on guy. I do think that there needs to be collaboration, and I've worked with many companies, and if you look at the very successful companies, they all open an office in different countries. And why do they do that? It's because it's been proven over and over and scientifically that diversity brings better solutions. And so I absolutely believe that diversity is needed. I just wanted to make one point, because I know you have lots of companies here that want to go to the US, and we were talking about Texas, and half my family's from Texas, and I love Texas. But if you go and talk about carbon markets in Texas, they're going to close the door. I mean, so you've got to do your research. I mean, look at, there's like, the US is a little bit like Europe. Europe's different countries, the US is different states, and they're very different. I was an energy commissioner for Arlington. It's the city where Amazon just started their second headquarters around Washington, D.C. And I had some colleagues from other cities, and they were telling me, Charles, like, don't come to my city with your companies and talk about climate change. I have 8 out of 9 board members. They don't believe in it. So when you come to see us, talk about energy efficiency, talk about different subject. And so they are straightforward.
Wait, stop there,
with me,
Charles.
and I love that.
On that, would you say that is a suggestion across the board? Let's not talk about climate change. Let's talk about energy efficiency. And now we have an energy price surge as well. Is that the recommendation for every state and every company? Or would you make a distinction?
Okay. Like I said, if you're in California, you're in New York, no worries. Talk about that. There's no problem. But if you go to Texas, you go to Florida, it's always a proportion, like a percentage chance, right? So let's say if you're in California, 80% of the people probably believe in that. But if you go to Texas, it's probably reverse. Like 20% believe in a carbon market. So will I go to Texas and talk about carbon market and take the risk that 20%, that will like that? No, because, ultimately you're a Swedish company. You want to get your product out there. You want to get your company growing out there. And so you don't want to say the wrong things. Like, I'll give another example. Like, I'm from Quebec originally. And when I was helping some Quebec companies, in Quebec, we tend to do a lot of jokes. And in the United States, culturally, they don't do jokes. And so my companies kept doing jokes during the meetings, and jokes in a different language. And so I was just there listening, and I was like, okay, you're never going to get this contract. Forget it. And so when they came, I said, you're not allowed jokes. Don't say jokes. Like, you're just, so that's what I'm saying. Like, culturally, like a company that wants to start exporting, they've got to do their research. They've got to find the right people that culturally can help. I'm not saying like if you're Swedish, just hire Americans. I'm not saying that. I'm saying maybe out of 4 of your sales team, or hire 1 American so that he can influence your
or
other
she.
Swedens. Yeah, or she. Yeah. Sorry, and so to have like I said, diversity makes strong results, and I strongly believe in that.
And that goes back to my original point, which is there's just 2 different languages, and I think 2 different microcosms that we're dealing with, which is the Swedish environmental consciousness, and then I think just very different flavors across the different states. I'm also a Texan, And Texas is the #1 wind producer out of all the states. And I think that's magnificent. I mean, that shows so much power and so much strength in Texas. But that also shows the power of renewables and having conversations and being able to have those conversations in a way that are adapted to the audience, which I think was what Charles was saying, because it is all the states are just very, very different from each other, much like in Canada with the provinces.
Yeah.
But when you started, you were saying that there were a few states where you would recommend. Could you be more specific?
I really think that if, and again, it's a calculation based on return on investment and trade-off and context, but I think really focusing on some of the hard to abate sectors in some of the states like Kentucky, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, that are very focused on industry. I think that is, there's so much potential there, because you can talk about lower electricity costs, you can talk about different kinds of models, you can talk about retraining the workforce, you can talk about retrofitting, you can talk about conversion of oil refineries. I mean, there's so much opportunity there, but I really think that there needs to be sort of a different language or a different modification in order to bridge that divide. And yeah.
Hear you.
Let me quickly jump in just to note that I grew up in Alberta, which is the Canadian equivalent of Texas, and the same sort of thing happens in Alberta in terms of it's the top producer of wind energy. It's also, of course, the site of the oil sands, the world's second largest deposit of crude oil. And the Canadian government, which happens to have a carbon price, has a very strong set of policies. Is saying, look, we want to keep the production of oil from the oil sands, but we're going to do it in a much less emitting way. And maybe we'll eventually use those products for non-combustible purposes, like building, carbon fiber or something. So from my perspective, I think Swedish investors should look at Canada first, because Canada's kind of a middle ground between the United States and Europe,
bud.
Right? In terms of an approach that is aligned with a European sensibility about the priority of climate change, but it's also very free, much more of a free market enterprise place than much of Europe is. It's sort of this halfway place between the United States and Europe, and a great place to land. There's financial support from the Canadian government for innovation, hundreds of millions of dollars going into, for example, companies coming to set up EV battery plants or critical minerals refining centers to produce cathode active materials for EV batteries. You have to have those. It all happens in China now. North America is trying to reshore these things into North America, where we have the raw materials, and now we need to refine it and produce it all the way to batteries. So I think there's when you're thinking North America, this is to your audience, it's Canada, the United States, and Mexico. The United States is the greatest nation on earth. I'm an American and a Canadian. Canada's a very, very, very close second. But the challenge here is that, if you just think about the United States, you might miss an opportunity to come in through the side door. And that's where I think, Canada's really important.